As we have just barely closed the door on the 2011 legislative session, good government groups already have a new to-do list for Governor Andrew Cuomo. They are giving his first 6 months in office an incomplete grade, saying several issues still need to be addressed, including campaign finance reform and redistricting reform. Now, the governor promised to deal with both of these when he was campaigning in 2010. Advocates hope to see everything that he promised turn into action as we head into the fall. Here to explain more is Bill Mahoney of NYPIRG and Jessica Wisniewski of Citizens Action. Thanks very much for being here, both of you guys.
Thank you.
Actually, the incomplete grade comes from you, right?
Yeah, well, I was asked how I thought he had done with election reform so far.
Right.
And I had to say incomplete because he made a lot of promises this election about things he would do to reform the state's broken electoral process. And as of now, those have been pushed aside during the first legislative session for which he was governor, and hopefully they get taken up in the second or sooner.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, he had this insane, New York agenda that took up 6 or 8 books or something. I mean, the guy had a very aggressive agenda, right?
It's certainly true. He had a lot of things that he had proposed to take care of, and he got a lot of them done. But in terms of time sensitivity for the remaining issues he's got to tackle, some of these are the most important. Redistricting, for example, those lines will probably need to be drawn by March of next year. And as of now, we don't even have a commission, which everybody can agree is a functional one to actually draw these lines.
Well, the legislators think they have a functional commission. You're not agreeing with that?
I mean, our hope is that the lines are drawn in a nonpartisan way, and as long as legislators have pen to paper, that it's not going to be an independently drawn redistricting. And Governor Cuomo has reiterated that he'll veto any lines, and we're glad to hear that. So in the meantime, we hope they'll move quickly to figure out an independent redistricting commission.
Do you think there's wiggle room in what he said? I mean, specifically, you have to look very closely at his words. He says that he will reject anything that was drawn specifically in a partisan way, but it also seems that maybe there's a compromise to be had there. The legislators are hoping there's a compromise to be had there.
Well, let's hope not. I mean, he was pretty strong throughout his entire campaign that he would veto any lines drawn by the legislature in the LAT 4 process.
Yeah, he said several times that anything partisan he would veto, and just last week he said the LAT 4 process is partisan. So
Yeah.
It's clear that this current system, which they've started to hold hearings on, they're starting next week Tuesday in Syracuse, and they're going to be touring the state. It's clear that these don't fit his criteria for being fair enough to
Senator
create lines.
Nozzolio says they're out of time, that they don't have time for reform. You guys obviously disagree with that?
They've got until March, and they've got less time if they draw these lines, then find them vetoed and are stuck with 2 weeks for a judicial system to draw the lines, with them needing to adopt them in a day or two with no time for public input.
Right.
There's plenty of time left to make the independent commission. The bill that Cuomo originally proposed called for the commission's lines to be finished by this fall, so they've got a few months, which is probably how much time LAT 4 will be spending drawing these lines.
Well, we've heard the Senate's coming back maybe as soon as August, so there's really an opportunity there to do all kinds of unfinished business, this being one of them.
Right. Well, before we actually get to the unfinished business, I also want to just touch on the issue of transparency. I mean, this is what the governor actually, when he was just campaign Cuomo, was saying that he would actually make himself and his administration the most transparent in history, or at least in modern history in New York. He did get rid of Fort Pataki, which is, of course, this very closed-down situation that we had on the second floor. Now I or you or anyone could just walk around on the second floor and knock on the door and say, "Hi, Governor, are you there?" On the second sort of hand, it's a little bit still happening in the 3 men in a room, in the dark situation, isn't it?
Yeah, especially during the last few weeks of session, but for all the past 6 months, we've seen a lack of access to figure out what's really going on behind the closed doors, and most of the time we don't know that a deal's reached until all 3 of the leaders shake hands and come to a tentative agreement.
Yeah, and even when they do that, sometimes a deal hasn't been reached.
Yeah, the public still can't say with confidence that they're close to being finalized, because there's sometimes these major problems that they have still yet to work out, and we're left in the dark about who's on the fence, what issues still need to be worked out, because there haven't been any public discussions.
And sometimes the legislators haven't even had their opportunity to really read through the legislation. So maybe not 3 men in a room. Oftentimes the chairs of committees are a part of those discussions, but too often we aren't seeing legislation as the public and advocates, and some even legislators, until the deal's already made.
Okay, so really incomplete on redistricting reform, incomplete on transparency. There's still room to grow on that one.
Of course.
Let's talk about campaign finance. This is a pet issue for both of you guys, right? I would say. You would like to see, in a perfect world, full campaign finance. Everybody gets public financing for their campaigns.
Yeah, a public finance financing option, public financing of elections option, we call voter-owned elections, right? Because really you're allowing the voters to participate more, give more small donations. We'd like to see that happen across the board. And we were happy to see it did make Governor Cuomo's to-do list as a candidate. And, you know, he had lots of reform and ethics on his plate this legislative session. We hope campaign finance reform in lowering the sky-high contribution limits that exist now, closing some loopholes, and instituting public campaign finance as an option for legislators will be a major priority next legislative session.
Okay, but two things about this. A, it's expensive, isn't it?
Some people have found that it pays for itself when you're a candidate for office and you have to rely on special interests who will eventually be asking for favors of the government. That can cost taxpayers money because maybe there will be some economic development deal that goes to a corporation that donated millions of dollars to the state legislators.
Yeah.
Or maybe there will be a union that funds them that winds up getting a deal from the state legislature.
I agree with you in theory, but difficult to argue to the taxpayers who are already sort of taxed to the nines to say, okay, it cost you $30 to $40 million to set up a complete public financing system for everyone, and at the back end there was a $200 million economic development project that would bridge to nowhere that would have occurred that didn't occur because X is not beholden to Y.
It's a difficult argument, but I've found that every poll I've seen on the issue finds that a vast majority of New Yorkers support reforming the system and getting a system like public financing put into place. So I don't think there's a whole lot of selling that needs to be made to the public. I think they're already sold that something needs to change with the way things currently work.
Okay, but how come it hasn't happened yet, though? I mean, we just saw the U.S. Supreme Court shoot down a piece of a law in Arizona.
That's true, but they also upheld the fact that public financing of elections is completely constitutional and can move forward in the places where it already exists, like New York City, for example. And you know, I think it's more of a, back to your other question, it's a culture shift in Albany. Why hasn't it happened, right? We're talking about election reform, we're talking about campaign finance reform. These are big lifts.
Yeah.
And I'm inspired by the governor that he says, you know, we want to change the culture of Albany, we want to change Albany. These are all pieces of that puzzle that needs to be a top priority. And the public is completely there. Over 70%, both Democrats, Republicans, and independents fully support public campaign finance reform.
We've actually seen that it's incremental, right? The governor was willing to make deals in order to get ethics reform that I think the entire good government community recognizes is not the perfect picture that they were hoping for, but better than what was existing in the past.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sorry.
There's a lot of pieces of campaign finance that could be worked out without going the whole shebang right away. We would love to see public financing, and the sooner the better, in our opinion, for both of our groups. But there's a lot of other things, like lowering the contribution limit so that I couldn't write a check for $100,000 to a political party.
Which you can do now,
I can do it. I can give you even more.
if you had it.
If I have a bunch of LLCs incorporated in my name, they could each write checks for that amount, and I could give millions of dollars to a single party or
Which
candidate in some cases.
all
yes.
the time.
And on public financing, we can step that in also. We don't have to do all of it in the same year, right? So this past legislative session, Comptroller DiNapoli drafted and proposed, and the Assembly picked up a bill for just public financing for state comptroller races. So that would be a great first step, and then maybe other statewides, and then the full legislature down the road as we, you know, and then you can raise money over time. And the public can see the benefit and understand the system as we go.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. I just want to briefly, and we have touched on this actually on this show, although not with you guys, but with Dick Dady from Citizens Union, not to be confused with your group, of course. But the special elections issue, this was someplace where you disagreed with the governor.
Yeah, he decided to call for the 6 assembly seats and the congressional seat to have those elections held on primary day, as opposed to November when the general election is happening.
Right.
Now, for the assembly seats, we had sent him a letter requesting that they hold them in September, or that they hold them in November rather than September. This would give candidates a chance to petition to get on the ballot more time than they have right now, and it would also allow primaries, which we're not seeing. Party leaders are just picking whoever the candidates they want to run, and they're going to win their party's nomination for them. It's very unlikely that they won't. And and as we've seen also, the turnout is much higher in November than September, so the public could participate more if the election's held then.
So room to grow for Andrew Cuomo in this particular area, too. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I know you guys will both be back. I want to thank you very much. Bill and Jessica, thanks a lot for being with me.